The chandeliers cast too much light, and I felt exposed beneath them like a specimen under glass. Every carefully applied layer of foundation suddenly inadequate against the brilliance. I had chosen the emerald gown specifically for its high neckline and long sleeves, the silk cool against skin that still ached in three distinct places where David's fingers had pressed too hard, where his ring had caught and torn. The makeup artist at the department store counter had been skilled and blessedly incurious, her brushes feather light over the purple shadow along my jaw, the deeper bruise hidden beneath my ribs that pulled with every breath. I should not have come tonight, but David insisted, his voice that particular calm that meant refusal would cost me. So here I stood at the annual Ashmore Foundation Gala, surrounded by the city's wealthiest and most powerful, nursing a glass of champagne I would not drink because I needed every sense sharp and available. The ballroom was all marble and gold, women in gowns that cost more than my monthly salary, men in tuxedos that fit like second skins, and I was searching for the exits the way I always did now, mapping escape routes even at charity events. That was when I felt it, the weight of a gaze different from the casual glances sliding past me. I turned and found him watching me from across the room. Alexander Ravenscroft. I knew who he was because everyone knew who he was. The man who owned half the city through means polite society pretended not to understand, whose name was spoken carefully, and whose presence at events like this was tolerated because his money was as green as anyone else's and twice as plentiful. He was tall and built like violence contained in expensive tailoring, dark hair swept back from a face too harsh to be handsome, but compelling in its severity, and his eyes were the cold gray of a winter sky before snow. He was looking at me with an intensity that made my pulse spike with fear that had nothing to do with David. Then he moved, and it was predatory grace, cutting through the crowd with people parting without seeming to realize they were doing it, and suddenly he was there in front of me, close enough I could smell his cologne, something dark and cedar sharp. He introduced himself as though I might not know him, and his voice was deep and controlled, every word deliberate. We spoke of nothing, the kind of polite conversation that happens at these events, but his eyes never left my face, and I felt examined, assessed, seen in a way that made me want to run. The warmth of the ballroom, the lights, the champagne in my system, something made my carefully constructed mask begin to slip. I felt it, the subtle crack of foundation along my jaw, and his eyes tracked the movement with predator focus. His expression changed, froze into something terrifying in its stillness. He leaned closer, invading my space, and when he spoke his voice was deadly calm, almost gentle. Who? Not a question. A demand delivered soft as silk over steel. I opened my mouth to deflect, to lie, to laugh it away. But then David was there, his hand possessive on my waist, right over the bruise on my ribs, and I could not quite hide the flinch. David smiled his public smile and greeted Alexander Ravenscroft with the hearty, false warmth of someone trying to pretend at ease. Alexander looked at David's hand on my waist, looked at David's face, looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes. Then he stepped back, nodded once, and walked away without another word, leaving me shaking and certain that something had just begun that I did not understand and could not stop. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The car ride home was silent in the way that made my stomach clench. David's hands tight on the steering wheel, jaw working with words he was saving for when we were behind closed doors, and I stared out the window at the city lights blurring past and thought about gray eyes and that single word delivered like a bullet. Who? When we entered the apartment, David did not wait, did not even remove his jacket before turning on me with barely controlled fury, asking what I thought I was doing. Did I know who that man was? Did I have any idea what kind of attention I had just drawn? And I tried to explain that Alexander Ravenscroft had approached me, that I had done nothing to encourage it, but David was beyond listening. He knew who Alexander was, because everyone knew, the most dangerous man in the city, and I had stood there chatting with him like an idiot, smiling at him, making David look like a fool in front of people who mattered, and then his hand was around my upper arm, fingers digging into the existing bruise, and I gasped at the spike of pain, but knew better than to pull away, because that always made it worse. He shoved me back against the wall, not hard enough to leave new marks on visible skin, because David was always so careful about that, and told me I was an embarrassment, that he brought me to these events to reflect well on him, and I could not even manage that simple task. And then finally he released me and walked away to pour himself a drink, leaving me trembling against the wall until I could breathe properly again. I went to bed alone and lay awake trying not to think about cold gray eyes and the certainty in Alexander Ravenscroft's expression when he looked at David's hand on my waist. Morning came with sunlight through curtains and David already gone to his office, so I dressed carefully in a high-necked blouse and went to work at the Ashford Gallery, where I had been assistant curator for 3 years, where the art was beautiful and the silence was peaceful, and I could pretend for hours at a time that my life was normal. My manager, Rebecca, greeted me with unusual excitement, explaining that the building had been purchased over the weekend by a private investor, some wealthy collector who apparently had interest in maintaining the gallery, and I felt the first flutter of unease before she even said his name. Alexander Ravenscroft. He arrived at 11 that morning, tall and imposing in charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my car, and requested a private viewing with me specifically, and Rebecca practically pushed me forward, thrilled at the attention from such a prominent collector. The gallery emptied. We were alone among the paintings, his footsteps echoing on hardwood as he circled me with predatory patience, not looking at the art at all, only at me. He asked how I was, and the question was weighted with meaning. I said I was fine, and he smiled without warmth. He asked about the bruises, and I felt ice slide down my spine. I lied, said I had fallen, clumsy on the stairs, nothing serious. And he stopped walking, turned to face me directly, and told me in that deadly calm voice that he was a patient man, but he always got answers, always, and I should remember that. Then he handed me a card with a single phone number printed on it, no name, nothing else, and told me to call when I was ready to stop lying. He left without viewing a single piece of art, and I stood there holding the card like it might burn through my skin, terrified and confused, and some small buried part of me desperately, dangerously hopeful. I noticed him on Tuesday afternoon, the man in the black sedan parked across from the gallery, too still and too watchful to be waiting for anyone in particular. And when I left work at 6, he followed 3 cars back all the way to my neighborhood, before peeling away when I turned onto my street. Wednesday, there was a different car, dark blue SUV with tinted windows, and a woman in designer athleisure doing a very convincing impression of jogging, except she circled my block 4 times in the span of an hour. Thursday, I spotted 2 men in the coffee shop where I bought my morning latte, dressed too well for the neighborhood, drinking espresso and not looking at their phones the way everyone always looked at their phones. And when I walked past their table, one of them spoke quietly into his wrist, and I knew with cold certainty that Alexander Ravenscroft had not forgotten me, that he was having me watched, and I did not know if I should feel safer or more terrified. David noticed nothing because David was drowning in his own private catastrophe, coming home later each night smelling of whiskey and desperation. His gambling debts metastasizing into something he could no longer hide behind charm and promises. He snapped at everything, his temper a live wire I had to navigate with increasing care, and I made myself smaller and quieter and tried to become invisible the way I had learned to do. Friday night, he came home at 2 in the morning and woke me demanding to know if I had money hidden anywhere, any savings he did not know about, and when I said no, he called me useless and shoved me hard enough. I hit the nightstand, my cheekbone connecting with the corner in a burst of white pain. I tasted blood. The room tilted and steadied, and David was already walking away, leaving me crumpled on the floor with my face throbbing and something finally breaking loose inside my chest, some last tether of hope that this would get better snapping cleanly in two. I found my phone with shaking hands and pulled out the card I had hidden in my wallet behind my expired gym membership, the one with a single number printed in plain black type, and I called it at 2 in the morning not knowing what else to do or where else to turn. He answered on the first ring, his voice alert and cold, saying my name like a statement of fact, like he had been waiting. I tried to speak, but my throat closed around the words, and all that came out was a broken sound that might have been his name. He asked where I was, and I told him, and he said to lock myself in the bathroom, not to open the door for anyone but him, that he was coming now. And 20 minutes later, I heard the knock, 3 sharp raps, and his voice low through the door telling me it was safe. I opened it, and he filled the doorway, tall and lethal in black shirt and dark pants like he had dressed for violence. And when he saw my face, something passed across his expression that made my blood run cold, something ancient and murderous and barely leashed. He asked very quietly if David was here, and I shook my head, said he had left, and Alexander stepped into the bathroom and crouched in front of me where I sat on the closed toilet lid, his eyes level with mine. He asked permission to take me somewhere safe, said I did not have to be afraid anymore if I did not want to be, and I looked into those winter gray eyes and said yes. He brought me to a penthouse that touched the sky, all glass and clean lines and silence like a sanctuary, and when the door locked behind us, I finally let myself believe I might survive this. The first morning I woke in the penthouse with sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, disoriented by the silence and the clean smell of expensive linens, my cheek throbbing dully where it had met the nightstand but the pain somehow more bearable in this bright, sterile space. Alexander arrived at 9, with coffee and pastries from a bakery I recognized from magazine spreads, the kind of place where a croissant cost $12, and he set them on the kitchen island without fanfare before asking if I had slept, and I admitted not much, my body too wired with adrenaline and fear and the strangeness of safety. He nodded as if he expected this and told me to eat, that we would talk when I was ready, and then he sat across from me in perfect stillness while I forced down food I could barely taste. The days developed a pattern. He came every morning and every evening, bringing meals or groceries, asking careful questions that I answered in fragments, each truth harder than the last. He never pushed, but his patience was relentless, a steady pressure that made lying feel more exhausting than confession. On the third day, I told him how it started, how David had been charming at first, attentive, how the criticism crept in so gradually I barely noticed until I was apologizing for everything, walking on eggshells in my own home. Alexander listened with a stillness that felt dangerous, his gray eyes never leaving my face, and when I faltered, he waited until I could continue. On the 5th day, he told me about himself, about growing up in foster care after his mother died and his father disappeared into a bottle, about the violence he survived and the violence he learned to wield, about building an empire from blood and fear because it was the only language the world had taught him. His voice was matter of fact, no self-pipity, just cold recitation of facts. And I understood then that he saw himself as a monster and had made peace with it long ago. On the 8th day, I told him everything, the full 18 months of David's escalating abuse, the isolation from friends and family, the times I had tried to leave and been convinced to stay, and when I finished, Alexander was silent for a long moment before promising in a voice like winter that David would never touch me again, never come near me, that I was under his protection now, and he kept what was his. I asked what he would do, and his smile was a terrible thing. He said I did not want to know the details, and he was probably right. But some part of me, some dark ember I had not known existed, wanted David to be afraid the way I had been afraid. Alexander never touched me without asking first, never crowded my space, And somehow, that careful distance made me feel safer than any lock ever had. I realized on the 10th day, watching him move through the kitchen making dinner with surprising domesticity, that I trusted this dangerous man more than I had trusted anyone in years, and that terrified me almost as much as it felt like salvation. David reported me missing on day 12, and Alexander told me about it over breakfast, with the same calm he used to discuss the weather, saying his lawyers were already handling it, but I should expect police contact within 24 hours. The detective arrived that afternoon, a tired woman in her 40s named Sarah Chen, who looked at me with practiced assessment, taking in the fading bruise on my cheek and the way I sat very straight in the penthouse chair, and she asked gentle questions about my relationship with David Chamberlain while Alexander sat beside me silent as winter. I gave my statement with shaking hands, told the truth about the abuse and my choice to leave, and Detective Chen nodded slowly before saying, David had filed the report claiming I was mentally unstable and possibly in danger. Playing the concerned partner so convincingly, her department had taken it seriously until they ran Alexander Ravenscroft's name, and suddenly everyone wanted to tread very carefully. She asked if I was here of my own free will, and I said yes. Asked if I wanted to press charges against David, and I hesitated before saying I needed time to think, which we all knew meant I was afraid, and she left her card saying I could call any time. Alexander's lawyers made the missing person case disappear within 48 hours, but David was not finished, could not accept that I had slipped from his control into protection he could not penetrate. My mother called on day 15, her voice cold and confused, saying David had contacted her claiming I had been manipulated by a dangerous man, that I needed help, and I tried to explain, but she talked over me asking how I could do this to poor David who loved me so much, and I realized he had already poisoned that well beyond repair. My sister texted asking if I had lost my mind, getting involved with a criminal, throwing away my life and reputation. And I stopped responding because what could I say that would make them understand I felt safer with Alexander Ravenscroft than I had ever felt with David Chamberlain. I watched my old life disintegrate from the penthouse windows, feeling unmoored and strange, like I was becoming someone new and did not yet know who she would be. Alexander found me there on day 18, staring at the city spread below, and asked what I needed, and I surprised myself by saying I needed work, real work, not charity or make-believe, but something that mattered. He studied me for a long moment before offering me a position managing art acquisitions for his legitimate businesses, galleries and auction houses, and private collections that needed someone with expertise and taste, and the salary he quoted made my gallery assistant wages look like pocket change. I asked if he was serious, and his slight smile said he never offered anything he did not mean. I accepted, needing independence more than I needed safety, needing to prove I could stand on my own even under his protection. We started working together daily, his office connected to mine by a door he kept open, and I discovered I was good at this, had an eye for value and authenticity that his clients appreciated. The attraction between us pulled tighter each day, a wire strung increasingly taut, his eyes following me with barely restrained hunger while he maintained his careful distance, never touching, always proper, and I started to ache for him in ways that felt dangerous and inevitable and utterly beyond my control. I discovered I had a gift for reading people through their art choices, could assess a collector's true wealth and taste within 3 questions, and within 6 weeks, I had brokered 4 major acquisitions that earned Alexander's companies over $2 million in commissions. He watched me work with something like pride in those gray eyes, standing in doorways observing my negotiations with clients who did not know or did not care that the beautiful woman selling them a Rothko was sleeping in a Mafia boss's penthouse, and I felt myself unfurling like something that had been clenched tight for too long. The business dinner happened on a Thursday, one of Alexander's quarterly meetings with associates from various enterprises, held at an upscale restaurant he owned where the private room cost more than my old monthly rent. I wore black silk that Alexander had bought me, simple and elegant, and I sat beside him feeling the weight of eyes assessing me, calculating what I meant to him, what vulnerability I represented. Most of the men treated me with careful respect, but Victor Maroney, a captain in the Lennox organization, smiled at me with too many teeth and asked Alexander if he was getting soft in his old age, keeping pets now instead of focusing on business. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Alexander set down his wineglass with precise control and said in a voice like silk over steel that I was not a pet, but his partner, and anyone who failed to show appropriate respect would find themselves having a very different conversation in a very different location. Victor laughed, but it sounded hollow, and he said he meant no offense, simply observing that a man's weaknesses could be exploited by those paying attention. Alexander leaned back in his chair, utterly relaxed, utterly lethal, and told Victor that threatening what was his was an exceptionally poor decision, that I was under his protection, and anyone who touched me or spoke of me with anything less than courtesy would learn exactly why people feared the Ravenscroft name. The room was silent. Victor nodded slowly, understanding he had miscalculated badly, and the dinner continued with brittle civility. But the adrenaline sang through my veins, fear and something else, something hot and fierce that Alexander had claimed me so absolutely in front of dangerous men. We rode back to the penthouse in charged silence, his hand on my thigh burning through silk, and when we entered the apartment, he turned to me with barely restrained hunger and asked if I was all right. I said yes. He stepped closer, close enough I could feel his heat, and asked in a rough voice if Victor had frightened me, and I admitted yes, but also no, that knowing Alexander would protect me made me feel safer than I had ever felt, and that terrified me and exhilarated me in equal measure. He cupped my face with hands that had killed, thumbs brushing my cheekbones with impossible gentleness, and asked if I wanted this, wanted him, because once we crossed this line there would be no going back, and I needed to be certain. I was certain. I had never been more certain of anything. I kissed him first, rising on my toes to press my mouth to his, and he made a sound low in his throat before kissing me back with fierce, claiming intensity, one hand sliding into my hair while the other pulled me against him, and he was shockingly tender given his reputation, given everything I knew he was capable of, kissing me like I was precious and breakable and his. We fell into each other with the intensity of people who had both lived too long in careful control, and in the days that followed, Alexander showed me parts of himself I suspected no one else had seen, like the scar across his ribs from a knife fight when he was 17 and still clawing his way up from nothing, or the way he made coffee in the mornings with meticulous precision because routine was how he maintained sanity in a world of chaos. He told me about his father, who drank himself to death, and his mother who disappeared when he was 12, about building his empire. One brutal decision at a time, until he owned half the city, but felt empty in ways money could not fill. And I listened with my head on his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath my ear. I told him things I had never said aloud, about how David had slowly isolated me from friends and family, about the shame that had kept me silent, about the woman I used to be before fear became my constant companion, and Alexander held me through those confessions with a tenderness that broke something open inside me. He introduced me to his inner circle on a Sunday, James Sinclair arriving first with assessing dark eyes and a firm handshake, telling me he had worked with Alexander for 11 years and never seen him like this, vulnerable and human, and I should know the entire organization would protect me as they protected him. Catherine Ravenscroft swept in an hour later, Alexander's younger sister with his same gray eyes but warmer, pulling me into a hug and whispering that I had performed a miracle making her brother smile like that. And over wine she told me stories of their childhood that made Alexander uncomfortable and made me love him more. I felt myself weaving into the fabric of his life, belonging in ways I had not belonged anywhere in years. But David had not disappeared into whatever hole desperate men crawl into when they lose. Alexander's intelligence network reported he was drowning in gambling debts. Over $2,000 owed to loan sharks and bookies, including substantial amounts to the Lennox organization, and desperate men made dangerous choices when they had nothing left to lose. James brought the information on a Wednesday, standing in Alexander's office with grim expression, saying they had intercepted communications suggesting David was trying to make a deal, offering information about me, about my connection to Alexander, to anyone who would listen. I felt ice slide down my spine. Alexander's face went cold and distant, the killer surfacing beneath the lover, and he asked James to leave us alone before turning to me with something like anguish in his eyes. He said David was planning something, that the Lennox family saw me as leverage to use against him, that I had become a target the moment I accepted his protection, and he was sorry, so sorry for bringing this danger to my door. I touched his face and told him I chose this, chose him, chose risk over the certain destruction of staying with David, and nothing that came next would make me regret that choice. He pulled me close, holding me like I might vanish, and I felt him trembling with the effort of not locking me away somewhere safe and distant, where I would be protected, but also alone. The threats were circling closer. We both knew blood was coming. James came back 2 days later with confirmation that made Alexander's entire body go rigid, standing in the penthouse living room, with morning light slanting through floor-to-ceiling windows, while I sat frozen on the leather sofa, listening to words that felt like a death sentence. David had made contact with Victor Maroney, the Lennox captain who had threatened me at the dinner, offering detailed information about my routines, about the gallery, about security protocols he had observed during the months we were together, and the Lennox family was interested because leverage against Alexander Ravenscroft was valuable currency in the city's criminal economy. Alexander dismissed James with a curt nod and stood silent for a long moment, his back to me, hands clenched at his sides, and when he finally turned, his face was the cold mask I had not seen in weeks, the killer instead of the lover. He said security would triple immediately, that I would have 2 guards minimum at all times, that travel would be restricted to secure locations, and I felt the walls closing in even as I understood the necessity. I made it through 4 days of constant surveillance, of armed men flanking me at the gallery, of Alexander's tension radiating through every interaction before I finally broke, telling him over dinner that I could not live like a prisoner even if the cage was gilded and guarded. He set down his fork with careful precision and said in a low, dangerous voice that I did not understand the threat, that the Lennox family would use me to destroy him, and he would burn the entire city down before he let anyone hurt me. I stood from the table, shaking with frustration and fear and love, and told him I understood perfectly, but I would not let David take anything more from me. Not my freedom, not my choices, not the life I had started building. He rose too, towering and lethal, and suggested maybe I should leave the city entirely, go somewhere safe and distant, until he resolved the situation permanently. The words hit like a slap. I asked if he was sending me away, and he said he was trying to protect me, and I said protection without agency was just another kind of cage. We stood facing each other across the dining table, the space between us charged with everything unspoken, and I watched him struggle between the instinct to control and the knowledge that controlling me would destroy what we had built. I took a breath and said the words that terrified me, told him I loved him, that I loved him enough to risk staying, to risk everything, because a safe life without him was not a life I wanted anymore. His control shattered visibly, the mask cracking to show raw anguish beneath, and he came around the table pulling me against him with desperate strength. He said he had never felt this vulnerable, that I had become his greatest weakness, and also his greatest strength, that the thought of losing me made him understand for the first time what it meant to be truly afraid. I tilted my face up and kissed him, tasting his fear and hunger, and we made love on the living room floor with desperate intensity, both of us knowing conflict was coming, that blood would be spilled before this ended, and choosing each other anyway despite the cost. The attack came on a Thursday afternoon when the gallery was quiet between exhibitions. Just me and Marcus, one of Alexander's security men, standing near the entrance while I catalogued pieces in the back office. I heard the door chime and Marcus's voice raised in warning before the gunshot cracked through the air like thunder in a bottle, and I dropped behind the desk with my heart trying to punch through my ribs as heavy footsteps pounded across the hardwood floor. David's voice cut through the chaos, higher than I remembered, desperate and venomous, saying, "Eleanor, I know you're here and you're coming with me right now." And two other voices I did not recognize barked orders about securing exits and finding me quickly before Ravenscroft's reinforcements arrived. I pressed myself against the wall, shaking so hard my teeth chattered, phone in my trembling hand already dialing Alexander's number when the office door exploded inward and David stood there with a gun hanging loose in his grip and wild eyes that barely looked human anymore. He said we were leaving, that I belonged to him, that he would burn down everything Alexander built if I did not come willingly. And I saw two men behind him wearing the hard faces of criminals who killed for money rather than passion. Then Marcus appeared in the doorway, bleeding from his shoulder, but still moving, weapon raised, and everything became noise and motion. Marcus firing twice, dropping one of the Lennox soldiers, while the other grabbed David and pulled him toward the rear exit, shouting that the whole building was about to be swarming with Ravenscroft soldiers. David looked at me one last time with something like hatred mixed with longing before disappearing through the back door. And Marcus collapsed against the doorframe, pressing his hand to the wound, pumping blood between his fingers. I crawled to him, trying to remember first aid through the static in my brain, pressing my cardigan against the hole in his shoulder while he told me through gritted teeth that backup was 90 seconds out and I did good staying down. And I realized I was crying. Sobbing, actually, saying I was sorry over and over like an incantation against guilt. Alexander's team flooded the building. James Sinclair appearing with controlled fury, calling for a medic, securing the scene with military efficiency, and then Alexander himself burst through the front entrance, scanning the room until his eyes found me kneeling in Marcus's blood. He reached me in 4 strides, pulling me up and into his arms with a desperation I had never felt from him before, his hands running over me checking for injuries while I shook apart against his chest. He carried me to a car, and we followed the ambulance to St. Catherine's Hospital, where I sat in the surgical waiting room, staring at Marcus's blood on my hands and clothes, while Alexander made calls with lethal quietness, his fury a living thing coiling through the sterile air. When he finally sat beside me, I broke completely, great gasping sobs that hurt my chest. And he held me while I cried for Marcus, who took a bullet protecting me, for the violence that kept finding me, no matter how far I ran, for the impossible position of loving a man whose world was built on calculated brutality. Alexander said into my hair that this was not my fault, that David made his choices and would answer for all of them, and I pulled back, looking into those gray eyes, and asked him through tears not to kill David, not to carry that specific blood on his hands because of me. He went very still, something dangerous flickering across his face, and for a long moment I thought he would refuse. But finally he said he would not personally end David's life, though he could not promise David would survive his other debts, and I understood that was the most mercy Alexander Ravenscroft had ever offered anyone. Marcus survived surgery and was transferred to a private recovery facility Alexander controlled within 36 hours. And I visited him there, feeling the crushing weight of responsibility, even as he told me gruffly that taking bullets was part of the job and I should stop looking at him like a kicked puppy. Alexander spent those 2 days in constant motion, meetings behind closed doors, phone calls conducted in clipped, dangerous tones, and I knew he was planning something that would end this permanently one way or another. On the 3rd morning, he found me in the penthouse kitchen, staring at coffee I had not drunk, and told me he had requested a sit-down with Thomas Lennox, the head of the Lennox family, and that it would happen that evening at neutral ground. I asked what he intended to offer, and he said whatever it took to remove David from the equation without more of his people bleeding, and I heard the unspoken truth that his restraint was entirely for my sake, that without my request for mercy, he would have already painted the city red. He left at 7 wearing a black suit that made him look like death personified, James and 4 others flanking him, and I spent 3 hours pacing the penthouse, imagining every possible disaster, until my phone finally rang at 10:23. Alexander's voice came through steady and controlled, saying it was done, that Thomas Lennox had agreed to terms, and I sagged against the window with relief, turning my legs liquid. He returned an hour later and told me the details while pouring scotch with hands that were perfectly steady, unlike my own. Thomas had been reasonable, pragmatic in the way of men who understood that wars were expensive, and Alexander Ravenscroft was not an enemy you made without extraordinary reason. And when Alexander made clear that continued pursuit of me meant total mutual destruction, Thomas had listened. Alexander offered to cover David's outstanding debts to the Lennox organization in full, $340,000. That meant nothing to Alexander's resources, in exchange for information about David's current location and a guarantee that the Lennox family would withdraw completely. Thomas had agreed, even expressed something like respect for Alexander's claim over me, the old-world courtesy of criminals who understood possession and territory. David was hiding in a motel called the Riverside Inn, 40 miles outside the city, a run-down place that rented rooms by the hour and did not ask questions. Alexander's team was already moving, coordinated and efficient, and by morning, David would be in custody one way or another. I asked what custody meant, and Alexander looked at me with those gray eyes that had seen and done terrible things and said that David would be delivered to the authorities with evidence of assault, attempted murder, and enough financial crimes to guarantee years in prison, that he was keeping his promise not to personally end David's life, even though every instinct screamed for blood. I crossed to him and wrapped my arms around his waist, pressing my face against his chest, feeling his heart beat steady and strong beneath expensive fabric. He held me carefully, almost reverently, and said that tomorrow we would finish this, that I could have closure or distance, whichever I needed. I told him I needed to see David one last time, to face him without fear, and Alexander tensed, but nodded slowly, understanding that some demons required confrontation to finally die. We left the city before dawn, 3 vehicles moving in formation through streets still slicked with night rain, and I sat in the back of the middle car, with Alexander's hand covering mine, while my heart hammered against my ribs like something trying to escape. He had argued against bringing me for 2 hours the previous night, pacing the penthouse with controlled agitation, saying I did not need to see David cornered and desperate, that some memories burrowed deep and festered. But I held firm, because I needed to face the man who had made me small and speak to him from the woman I had become. The Riverside Inn materialized from gray morning mist, looking exactly as diseased as its reputation promised, peeling paint and cracked concrete, and windows covered with blinds that had not been cleaned in a decade. Alexander's team had surrounded the building an hour before we arrived, invisible but present, and James met us in the parking lot with his weapon drawn and his face carved from stone. "Room 14, he said. David had been inside all night with nowhere left to run, and no one left to call, and Alexander looked at me one final time, asking without words if I was certain. I nodded, and we walked to the door together, James and 2 others flanking us. And when Alexander knocked, it was not a request, but an announcement of inevitable conclusion. David opened the door with a gun shaking in his right hand, and eyes that looked like haunted houses, all empty rooms and bad history, and when he saw me, something crumpled in his expression before hardening into brittle desperation. "Eleanor," he said, "you have to listen to me. I can explain everything. We can fix this if you just come home and tell your monster to back off." I stepped forward, feeling Alexander tense beside me, and said there was nothing to fix. That what he did to me across 18 months had killed whatever we had been, that I deserved better, and he needed help I could never provide. David's face twisted, and he said I had made him this way, that loving me had driven him to desperate choices, the same circular logic abusers always use to make their violence someone else's responsibility. Alexander spoke then, voice quiet and absolutely lethal, telling David to put down the weapon and accept what came next with whatever dignity he had left. David looked between us, and I saw the moment calculation turned to panic, saw him realize he had burned every bridge and exhausted every option, and his gun hand started rising toward Alexander with terrible slow-motion clarity. I moved without thinking, stepping partially in front of Alexander, and time became thick as honey, David's finger tightening on the trigger and Alexander's arms sweeping me sideways, and James moving like lightning, his shot precise and controlled, striking David's shoulder and sending the gun spinning across stained carpet. David collapsed screaming, and Alexander pulled me against his chest with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, the only sign of how badly my protective instinct had shaken him. James secured David while calling for the police, and I watched my former tormentor reduced to sobbing wreckage on filthy floor and felt nothing except relief that this chapter was finally ending, that the authorities would take him somewhere I never had to see him again, that the evidence Alexander had compiled would ensure justice I had never believed possible. Dr. Sarah Chen's office became a sanctuary I visited twice weekly, a neutral space with soft lighting and furniture that did not expect anything from me. And across 8 weeks, I unpacked the trauma piece by careful piece, examining how 18 months of escalating abuse had rewired my instincts toward fear and hypervigilance and self-blame. She helped me understand that loving Alexander, despite his dangerous world, was not repeating patterns, but choosing differently, that he had never once made me feel small or afraid or responsible for his emotions, that protection offered freely was not the same as control disguised as care. The nightmares came less frequently, the ones where David's gun fired and Alexander fell, and I woke gasping with my heart trying to escape my chest. And when they did come, Alexander held me in the dark and waited until my breathing steadied and never once made me feel weak for breaking. I called my mother on a Tuesday afternoon with hands that shook only slightly, and we spoke for 90 minutes about everything David had told her, the lies about my instability and manipulation, and I calmly corrected each distortion with facts she could verify. Medical records and police reports and testimony from people who actually knew me. She cried and apologized and asked if she could see me, and I said yes, but that our relationship would look different now, that I needed her to trust my choices even when she did not understand them. My father was harder, his pride wounded by David's deception and his judgment of Alexander too fixed to shift. And after 2 difficult conversations, I accepted that some bridges burned beyond repair, and that grief was appropriate, even when separation was necessary. My younger sister Emma drove 4 hours to meet me for coffee and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, telling me she had never liked David and was sorry she had not said so louder, and we rebuilt our relationship on honesty that felt like solid ground after years of swamp. At work, I continued exceeding expectations, acquiring a Rothko study for one of Alexander's hotels that increased the property value by 7 figures, and his business partners began requesting me specifically for consultations, respecting my expertise independent of my relationship with him. Alexander watched me thrive with something like wonder in his eyes, as though he had not quite believed I would stay once the immediate danger passed, that I would choose his complicated, dangerous world when I could have walked away to safety. He planned an event for late October, a fundraiser for arts education at the Gramercy Hotel, the same venue where we had first met 7 months and a lifetime ago, and when he asked if I would attend as his official partner, publicly claimed for his world to see, I said yes without hesitation. I bought a gown the color of deep wine, elegant and bold, nothing hidden beneath the fabric except skin that had healed completely. And when I walked into that ballroom on Alexander's arm, I felt the weight of eyes turning toward us, but none of the fear that had choked me at that first gala. I was Eleanor Whitmore, art acquisition specialist, partner to Alexander Ravenscroft, survivor of horrors that had not broken me, and I belonged exactly where I stood. The courtroom smelled like floor polish and old wood, and the particular staleness of a space where human desperation had seeped into the walls across decades. And I sat in the third row behind the prosecution with Alexander beside me, and his hand resting on my knee like an anchor keeping me steady, while the judge read David's sentence with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had delivered 1,000 verdicts and would deliver 1,000 more. 8 years in a state correctional facility, with possibility of parole after 5, charges including aggravated assault and attempted murder and fraud related to his gambling debts, and David stood in his orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I remembered, diminished by consequences he had spent so long outrunning. He turned before the bailiffs led him away, and our eyes met across the courtroom, and I expected to feel something sharp and vindictive, some satisfaction at his downfall. But there was only a distant sadness for the man he might have been if he had chosen differently at 100 small moments that accumulated into monstrosity. Alexander asked quietly if I was all right, and I nodded because I genuinely was. This chapter finally sealed and filed away in the archive of my history where it could not reach me anymore. We left through the side exit to avoid cameras, journalists still hungry for the story of the Mafia boss, and the woman he had saved from her abusive boyfriend. A narrative that was both true and incomplete in the way all public stories were. I returned to work the next day, with focus that felt clarifying, meeting with contractors about a gallery expansion Alexander was funding in the financial district, a project I had proposed that would showcase emerging artists alongside established names and create opportunities for people who had been overlooked by traditional institutions. His senior advisors had questioned the profit margins until I showed them projections for long-term cultural capital and property value increases, and Alexander had approved the budget without hesitation, trusting my vision the way he trusted very few people with anything. Catherine invited me to lunch at a cafe in the West Village where we sat by the window watching autumn leaves skitter across cobblestones, and she told me about her own escape years ago from a man who had tried to cage her, how Alexander had been the one to help her disappear and rebuild, and I understood then that his protection of me was not anomaly but pattern, that he collected broken things and gave them space to heal. She had become more than Alexander's sister. She was my friend in her own right, someone who understood the complicated geometry of loving dangerous men and choosing to stay anyway. And we made plans for the weekend, a gallery opening in Chelsea, and dinner after. Ordinary friendship in extraordinary context. At the penthouse that night, Alexander found me on the balcony, overlooking the city lights, scattered like fallen stars, and he wrapped his arms around me from behind and asked what I was thinking. I told him I was thinking about family, about how I had found it in places I never expected, that his people had become my people, and his world had become mine, not through coercion, but through choice renewed daily. He kissed my temple and said he had never imagined this. A future that included softness and partnership, and someone who saw all of him and stayed, and I turned in his arms to kiss him properly, tasting the vulnerability he showed only to me. The private jet touched down on an island I had not known existed outside of fantasies, a crescent of white sand and tropical vegetation so green it hurt to look at directly in the afternoon sun. And Alexander led me down the steps to where a single vehicle waited to take us to a house built of glass and pale wood that seemed to grow organically from the landscape. No security team followed us onto the sand, no armored SUVs idling at careful distances, just the two of us and a caretaker couple who lived on the far side of the island and would bring supplies once daily before disappearing back into their own routines. This was Alexander's sanctuary, purchased 8 years ago when the weight of his empire had nearly crushed him and he needed somewhere the violence could not reach, and he had shared it with no one until now, until me. We spent the first day simply breathing, walking the perimeter of the island barefoot with waves lapping at our ankles and no destination required. and I felt tension I had not realized I still carried begin to dissolve like salt in water. Alexander cooked dinner that night, something he rarely did in the city where private chefs handled such ordinary tasks, and I sat on the counter drinking wine and watching him move through the kitchen with surprising competence. And when he plated pasta with fresh-caught fish and herbs from the garden, I tasted care in every bite. We made love that night with the glass doors open to let in the sound of the ocean, slow and unhurried in a way we rarely managed in the city, where danger always crouched at the margins. And afterward he traced patterns on my bare shoulder and told me stories about the boy he had been before violence became his language, the child who had loved books and wanted to build things before his father taught him the only thing worth building was fear. The days blurred together in the best possible way. Mornings swimming in water so clear I could see fish darting between coral formations. Afternoons reading in hammocks strung between palms. Evenings cooking together and talking about futures that felt suddenly possible. On the fourth night, he taught me constellations his mother had shown him before she died, connecting stars into stories about hunters and bears and lovers transformed by jealous gods, and I memorized the sound of his voice soft with memory. We made plans for the gallery expansion, for investments in neighborhood projects that would launder money into legitimate good, for a life that acknowledged what he was while reaching towards something better. On the final evening, he led me to the beach as the sun descended in shades of orange and pink that seemed too vivid to be real, and we sat in the sand watching light drain from the sky and stars emerge one by one like promises. He took my hand and his pulse jumped against my fingers, nervous in a way I had never seen him nervous. And when he said my name, it sounded like prayer. He told me he had not believed in goodness before me, that he had built an empire on fear and control because it was the only power he understood. But I had taught him that strength could also mean gentleness, and protection could also mean partnership. He asked if I would marry him, not because I needed his name or his protection, but because he could not imagine a future where I was not his in every way that mattered. The ring was platinum, with a single emerald the color of deep water, and when I said yes, he pulled me against him, like I was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid. The garden behind Catherine's estate had been transformed with thousands of white flowers and candles in glass hurricanes that glowed like captured stars as evening descended, and the guest list numbered only 27 people, the inner circle who had earned their places through loyalty and blood, and the family members I had carefully selected after months of rebuilding trust on my own terms. My mother sat in the front row beside Catherine, an alliance I had not anticipated but had grown organic over wedding planning lunches, where they discovered shared love of art history and sharp commentary about patriarchal social structures. And my younger brother stood among Alexander's groomsmen, looking proud and slightly intimidated in equal measure. I wore a dress of silk so simple it was nearly severe, ivory column that required no concealment or strategic draping. My skin unmarked except for the faint scar on my collarbone from a childhood bicycle accident and the new tattoo on my inner wrist. A single line from a poem about choosing courage that I had gotten 3 weeks ago with Catherine holding my other hand. No bruises hidden beneath foundation. No fear coiled in my stomach. I walked down the aisle alone because I was giving myself to this marriage, not being transferred from one man's ownership to another's protection. And Alexander watched me approach with expressions so unguarded it made my breath catch. This man who ruled an empire with ruthless efficiency, undone by the sight of me in white. James Sinclair stood as best man, the person who had become Alexander's brother in every way that mattered, and when the officiant asked who supported this union, his voice rang clear with affirmation. We had written our own vows, and Alexander spoke first, promising to honor my strength and independence, to protect without smothering, to meet me as equal partner in building whatever life we chose to create, to never stop earning the trust I had given him. And his voice roughened on the final words, as he admitted I had taught him that love was not weakness, but the most dangerous vulnerability and the greatest strength. I promised truth, even when it was difficult, partnership that acknowledged both his darkness and my own capacity for shadows, to build family from choice rather than obligation, to stay, not because I needed rescue, but because I wanted the particular future only we could build together. And when I said I loved him for exactly who he was, monster and man intertwined, his eyes went bright. The kiss that sealed our marriage was gentle and fierce, and tasted like promise, and the small gathering erupted in applause that echoed off the garden walls. At the reception, we danced while a string quartet played, and Alexander held me like I was something precious and dangerous simultaneously. And I thought about the woman who had stood in another ballroom 14 months ago, hiding bruises and terror beneath expensive fabric, how she could not have imagined this transformation, this claiming of power and choice and love without conditions. Alexander whispered against my hair that I had saved him as surely as he had saved me, that before me he had been alive but not living. And I believed him because I knew the particular salvation of being truly seen and chosen anyway.